So let's set the table for the discussion, because I've heard so many views over the course of the week about how the situation in Venezuela would affect Canada and, more specifically for our purposes, Alberta. So, Martha, I'll just start with you. I'll sort of go right to left in terms of where you're seated. What do you think the implications are, the consequences of that are?
Well, I'll start with saying one of the things that has surprised me has been, in fact, a big disparity in the commentary. But I've also been struck by the fact that a number of Canadian pundits, people, just regular conversations, the lack of understanding among so many Canadians of the difference between heavy crude and Saudi Arabian oil, for example. Like, they're just not the same. And the fact that Canada produces heavy crude, as does Mexico, as does Venezuela, makes it a lot more interesting, both from challenge and opportunity for Canada, that an awful lot of people in the country don't recognize. What's interesting is people are starting to actually get that understanding because of what's been happening. For me, I think there's some challenges and some opportunities. Challenges, clearly, there is the opportunity of competing, displacing some of the oil that we export to the Gulf Coast, which is
very little, though. It's only 10% of what we produce.
Like, we produce a lot. 10% is not chump change, and that's what really frustrates me. These are big numbers, especially big numbers for Alberta, but also for the whole country. Where I see opportunities is that most of that, if it is going to displace Canadian crude from Venezuela, is likely going to open up more opportunity with China and other Asian countries. They're diverting oil from Venezuela that's originally going to China, now hopefully for them to the Gulf Coast. Our numbers from Trans Mountain, since that expansion's been open, they can't keep up with demand. Like, the demand from China alone has been surprisingly strong. You take away their Venezuelan imports, it becomes even more of an opportunity if we can actually get more egress off the West Coast.
Okay, I do want to explore China in greater depth a bit later, because Carney's heading to China, and I have a feeling this is sort of a very complicated situation that he's got to navigate with China, notwithstanding your point about opportunities. But just, Sonia, as you take a look at the terrain as it exists right now, what's your assessment?
Well, I'm not surprised at all that there's such a range of opinion on the threat that Venezuela oil coming back on the market might pose. That's been the case with everything for a long time. It's just there's going to be politics in there, and politicians are going to want to reinforce their narrative on whether it's how urgent it is to get a new West Coast pipeline going. But I think you go back to some basic facts, and it doesn't seem to be disputed that 10% of Canadian oil could be at risk in the short term, in the near term, with Venezuelan oil coming back on the market. Right now, we ship about over 4 million barrels a day into the U.S. 3.5 is the production that's heavy oil. 3.2 million barrels a day goes into the U.S. Of that, about 2.5 million goes into PADD 2, into the U.S. Midwest, and another 350 to 450,000 barrels a day goes into the Gulf Coast. That's what's at risk, is that 350 to 450,000 barrels a day in the Gulf Coast. A lot of people say that, and pundits are saying, that's competition, that's not an existential crisis. But 10%, as Martha said, 10% is significant.
So that's not chump change.
That's not chump change. And you have to look at what the impact is, not only on the oil producers and the oil and the energy industry, but what is the impact on governments, on government revenue? And in Alberta, 10% is not junk change. 10% of the production means is a significant impact on the provincial budget and on royalties. Even a $1 a barrel decrease in the price of oil, or a spread in the differentials, is $750 million to the provincial budget in royalties. Western Canada Select is $14 lower than WTI.
Right.
WTI is about $7 lower right now than the provincial budget forecasted. So we're looking at about a $9 billion deficit, and that's a reason to pull the fire alarm bell for the provincial budget. And another concern, like if the oil industry and some of the companies might be able to weather a spread in differentials, a reduction of price, some reduction of production, they will just rationalize that with reducing their capital spend. They will cut back on their budgets. That, again, is going to impact the provincial economy as much or more than the oil sector, because cutting back the budget, the capital budget, means fewer jobs for the province. Projects won't go ahead, budgets will be cut, royalties will be cut. So this is a big concern. So I take the contrarian view to many of the pundits who said this is not a big deal. I think it's a huge deal. It's a huge deal for the province and
the country,
for the industry,
and for the country,
and for the country.
Gitane?
Yeah, what can I say that hasn't already been said by these brilliant women? I agree. It is absolutely something we need to pay close attention to. I agree. There's the potential for very large impacts. I think we also need to acknowledge nobody has any clue what's going to happen here, right? I mean, there's a lot of assumptions that are baked into this. Like, the president saying that he's going to tell U.S. industry that they need to get into Venezuela, they need to modernize the infrastructure, that he's going to reimburse them for that $100 billion required to do so. Under normal circumstances, I would say that is not very likely, certainly not at $50 a barrel oil. But this is not a conventional president, and he's not afraid to use his power to achieve what he wants. And so I think we have to continue to expect the unexpected. And I think we do have to pay close attention to what our strategy is going into the CUSMA review. I mean, oil has always been a very big chit for us. It is our largest export. The fact that we produce heavy oil and the Americans do not has given us leverage. So what does this situation mean for that scenario? And it is of importance to our national economy. Like, yes, there'll be all of these impacts in Alberta if our oil gets displaced, but 40% of the jobs in the oil and gas sector are outside of Alberta. So this is the potential to have national consequences if the displacement happens.
As we speak, President Trump is meeting with the oil company executives, as we know. I was talking with Peter Terzakian, whom you all know or know of, and he's the deputy director of the Arc Energy Institute. And his view is that Donald Trump, they won't have any choice, essentially, is what he's saying. Trump has said out loud, $100 billion investment go, but he'll make it so that they really can't say no, because that's kind of how he operates. Yeah. So, if you agree with that conclusion, and just the looks on your faces tell me that you think that's likely, what are the implications of that?
Well, that's a longer term, right?
Yeah.
Where the $100 billion or so, I can't believe we're tossing these numbers.
Yes, I know.
But they are big numbers to bring the Venezuelan production back. So, the number we're hearing bandied about is $100 billion. But the industry is a
longer term industry, right?
But that's a much longer term. So if you spent $100 billion wherever it came from, you're still looking at a decade probably to actually, and let me just as an aside, the people who know that business and how to do it tend to actually be Canadians, right? Because we have that experience. So if you have the box of challenges to Canada and the box of opportunities, in the opportunity box is if people are really serious about rebuilding the Venezuelan capabilities, there's an awful lot of work to be done with Canadian expertise. There's a whole other political aspect to that, but park that. It's a longer-term thing to build up the production in Venezuela. But Venezuela is already producing about 1 million barrels a day. That's not a small amount.
But a new pipeline here is longer-term as well, right? Nothing happens quickly.
But, sometimes in Canadian history we have. Somebody explained to me that under Pierre Trudeau, pipeline was done in 2 years. Now, the world is very different. We all know that. But we have a federal government now that is very keen on making stuff happen. That's also a very different thing. We have a number of Indigenous communities that are very keen on having something happen.
We have a number that are not keen on
it.
Do. And we have a BC Premier, Sonia, who's not keen on it at all, and is saying we should be, if we're going to spend billions of dollars, it should be on refineries.
That is probably the dumbest thing I've heard a politician say. And either he's energy illiterate or he's just trying to distract. We've been through this before.
Do you know what
building
Peter
a
said?
refinery.
I just want to tell you, Peter said to me, he said, that's like building a bakery on a farm.
Exactly. And
Great analogy.
We've been through this before on the economics and the logistics of building a refinery, building more refineries, whether it's in Alberta or on the Northwest Coast. We heard that a decade ago, going through pipeline applications for Northern Gateway, for KXL, for Alberta Clipper. We heard all of that, and it was disputed and tossed out the window, saying that is wildly not economic. So he's either energy illiterate or he's trying to distract. And the next
Explain why it's energy illiterate, just for people who don't understand sort of the economics of refineries and where they need to be and to be at scale and all that.
You need to build the refineries in the location where the product is used. So the refineries are built in the United States because that's where the largest market for refined products are. We have
huge refinery complexes now in Asia and other parts of the world.
Because that's where the population is. So if we were to build a refinery on the west coast of BC, there's a number of problems with that. One, where's the product going to go? You're still going to have to put it on a ship and export it somewhere. So is he going to lift the tanker ban? Is it okay to put refined product on tankers and ship it, but not the oil? You'd still have to have a pipeline moving the product to the coast. So I think he's just trying to, he can't be that energy illiterate. I think he's just trying to distract and trying to show that he's cognizant of the economic pain that this could cause to Alberta and the rest of the country. But I mean, at this point, I think he should just back out of the conversation.
Okay. Entering the conversation is Mark Carney going to China. And, you know, Martha, you brought that up earlier, which I find so interesting just in the current context in particular. Because it's been some time since we've seen a prime minister make this kind of effort. But at the same time, Michael Kovrig, who all of you will remember was, you know, a former diplomat, was held in China for 3 years, is sort of warning that geopolitically he thinks this is going to get sticky, in his words, because he believes China wants to demonstrate to the U.S. that it has influence on Canada and weaken the bonds. Between Western allies.
He's right. We have to be very careful. I mean, I read the U.S. National Security Strategy that came out in December, all 33 pages of it. You know, they say you should take Trump seriously, but not literally. And yet I also think you should believe somebody when they show you who they are. And that document basically is carving the world up into 3 superpowers. We are part of the Western Hemisphere, which the U.S. has made very clear with its action in Venezuela, that is their backyard and they will do as they see fit. And if they see China as a threat and Canada cozies up too much to China, I think we have to be very careful because, you know, even parking a conversation about military action against Canada, which I can't believe we're having this conversation, but welcome to 2026, they have real means to destroy our economy if they so choose. And so we're going to have to be very careful about this effort to diversify our economy and how close we get to other nations that Trump does not believe share his economic or global vision. Like, it's a real delicate dance that the Prime Minister is going to have to do. Because on one hand, options give you power, right? That ability to access other markets is great for Canada. And also, when you're sitting beside a country that is breaking all of the rules when it comes to international relations, you got to be pretty careful.
Well, then you got to determine if it actually is an option or what kind of option it is.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's, if you look at what just happened in Venezuela, I mean, the justification, the legal justification Trump has used and others have used is to take out narco-terrorists. That's the justification. It's not the reason.
Has nothing to do with drugs.
To do it. And it
just like criticizing Canada for fentanyl. The volume of drugs crossing the border is like insignificant compared to what they were claiming.
Right.
No. It's not, and it's not just about oil either. It's largely about oil, but it's not about oil. It's about decoupling South America and the Western Hemisphere from China, Russia, Iran, from adversaries, and it's about the Monroe Document 2.0. And
but if you're trying to decouple and we're trying to couple.
And take a look at what, following this, what both the Energy Secretary Chris Wright and Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State, have said. Marco Rubio said that the U.S. doesn't need Venezuela oil, but what they won't allow is China to have control of it, to have their adversaries. Chris Wright said the same thing. They're not taking over Venezuela oil. They're preventing it to be sold from being sold to China.
So how are they going to feel about us selling to China?
I think that's
Very
a
good
big
question.
concern.
Yeah.
It depends how much.
Yeah.
Well, we already know they're moving tankers that were destined to, at least one of them I believe was destined to China. There was one under a Russian flag, so that's a little bit less clear. But already it's being made very clear that oil that's leaving Venezuela is not going over there now. It's coming into the States, and it's not necessarily because the Americans need it. They can get ours. It absolutely is geopolitical.
But it is an important signal for Canada, right? If you're willing to go after a tanker that is being escorted by a Russian submarine, it's a pretty strong message that you want to assert your dominance in the Western Hemisphere and you want to have a very strong hand in where those critical commodities go.
Well, and you know, all the depressing stuff that we're talking about, I don't know if you had a chance to read the Eurasia year-end, you know, what are the 2026 risks? One piece
Yes, I did,
that was,
actually.
I mean, talk about depressing. But one piece that I was, you sort of knew about, right, the increased use of drones in warfare. But there was one piece where they talked about, like, the number of fatalities in 2024 from drones was almost 40,000 people. But the piece that was really interesting was this rapid increase in cheap, effective drone technology is not just for weapons. The opportunity for disrupting supply chains, the opportunity for disrupting infrastructure at very low cost, very easily, by a whole lot of different people now, with varied interests, is also really, I mean, we have to be on our toes big time.
Well, there's also, people have been talking about oil and the effect on oil production, and that Trump was after the oil, but there's a critical and rare earth mineral story on this too. And South America, China has the Belt and Road Initiative out of China. China has invested probably hundreds of billions of dollars in South America to control the supply chain, not just in Venezuela, but across South America for critical and rare earth minerals. You control, in some cases, they have complete monopoly on some of these products, and they've showed predatory behavior. New entrants to the market get priced out. They've had export bans on some products that are important in military. So getting control of South America and getting China's control out of South America decoupled is probably just as important as the story that we're focusing on oil.
Do we need to hear different language from industry leaders in part, but more so from political leaders? And by that I mean, is there a point at which, I mean, you don't want to panic people, but does the urgency of sort of the situation, the broader context, obviously the U.S. primarily, but also what all the sort of global geopolitical implications are, does the language from our political leaders need to be more explicit in sort of framing what the risks are? Not discounting the opportunities as well, but the risk.
Their thinking sure better be. Like, we have to stop being such Boy Scouts in Canada. I mean, we've been so complacent for at least a quarter of a century, I think more. Not just because of geopolitics, our productivity numbers are terrible. Like, we're just not. We've been complacent really is the best word. And we started to become more aware of some of these challenges on the economic front when Donald Trump got elected and the whole tariff thing. But we are a very attractive slice of meat in a sandwich that is bordered by the Russians in the north and the Americans on the south. We have a lot of stuff that the rest of the world really wants and needs. So, you know, we have to really be much, much better, and maybe the language can be Canada has to really understand what is in Canada's best interests, and we have to be really realistic. I mean, this can be a very depressing conversation, but it won't be of any use unless we actually have corporate decision makers, political decision makers, actually saying this is serious. This is serious on a variety of fronts. We have to change our thinking. We have to be way more nimble, but we have to look after Canada's best interests, and we certainly can't trust the Americans. I don't know who we can trust, frankly, right now. And even if we want to have significant allies with Europe, the core of Europe, right? England, France, Germany, they're in deep trouble too. Their economies are not doing very well. They're surrounded by governments that are less and less aligned with the kinds of things that are important to us. So we as a country need our leaders, corporate, political, otherwise, people like these amazing women sitting at this table, to be able to say, we actually have to step up and really understand the concerns and start thinking about what are we going to do about it, because we have no choice now.
I think it would be, to start with, it would be helpful to really all get on the same page across North America, across the Americas, and understanding what Trump is trying to accomplish. Because there's so many different narratives. Some of them are coming, on Tuesday he'll say one thing, on Wednesday he'll say a different. But to understand what he's trying to accomplish, it was the same thing when tariffs first came back on the table. Well, first it was about fentanyl. Then it was about onshoring and jobs in the U.S. What it really is, I think all of this boils down to is decoupling the Americas, South America, North America.
It's a new
Greenland.
world order
It's a
is
new
being
world order.
established.
It's an
Decoupling
old
it from,
world order.
It's
from
an old-
China.
Sorry, what did you?
It's an old world order.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a back to the future scenario. It's exactly the Monroe Doctrine, which was
It
established
is.
in the 1800s to tell colonial powers to get out of the Americas.
Yep.
And then it became the Americans will treat the Western Hemisphere as their own backyard. So
Well,
it's
as
both of those
colonies.
things.
So if we
Right,
can get
Right,
on,
like as colonies.
if we
yes.
can get on the same page and sort of start understanding what he's trying to accomplish, maybe we can address what really is the concerns and what aren't the concerns. And I am quite alarmed with cozying up to China. I am quite alarmed with the upcoming trade mission over there. China today is not the China it was in 2010 when Northern Gateway Pipeline was first being developed. I remember in 2012, Stephen Harper led a trade delegation over to Beijing with agriculture and the oil and gas industry to try to open markets to China. That's not the China that we have now.
So who do we cozy up to then?
Well, I think we've got our largest market is right next door to the United States. Europe is an ally. Japan, other Asian countries are allies. So I think we need to open markets to those allies. We need to open markets to allies that are not going to poke the bear down south. The last thing we want,
Which China will do. in
which
your view.
China will absolutely do. We do export oil to China now off the TMX pipeline, and it doesn't seem to the amount and the volumes going there now do not seem to be raising red flags in the States. I haven't heard anything
Not yet.
and concerns yet. Venezuela already exports about 500,000 barrels a day to China. I don't know if that has been a big concern, but the U.S. has made it really, really clear that they're not going to let China take control of Venezuela's oil.
Okay, given the volatility of the situation, and that's putting it mildly, does this increase or decrease the incentive for a private proponent or proponents to build a new pipeline?
I think it increases the necessity for Canada, but I think it's still a big question mark for a private proponent, especially if the price of oil per barrel stays low, right? But from a national security perspective, from an economic security perspective, from a potential economic uplift for the province, I mean, if we can get our own oil to Tidewater, when Trans Mountain came on board, it decreased the differential, I think, by $9 a barrel. So that optionality absolutely is important. But I think given the volatility, it's so hard to predict what the price of oil is going to be, what global demand is going to be. Typically, as geopolitics get more uncertain, the price of oil goes up and the demand for oil gets greater, especially if there's a threat of any large-scale military activity. So all of that could point to a reason to do it. But I think in the face of that volatility, the federal government is going to need to step up. And if this is in the national interest, then we need to declare that it is so. obviously some very difficult conversations to be had in British Columbia and with First Nations, and also if this is something we need to do, because to your earlier question about the rhetoric, I think Prime Minister Carney is moving in that direction. He has to, it's a very delicate dance, right? Like when he went to Washington the last time and had that meeting in the Oval Office, I think that was brilliant in terms of strategy and diplomacy, because he went to the Oval Office, he kissed the ring, he demonstrated deference towards the president, which is what he wants, right? Because I think that the Prime Minister understands the challenge that Canada faces from an economic perspective and the need to continue to make this relationship work in some way. So we have to be careful. Like Sonya's point about having conversations across the Americas, we need to be very careful how we do that so they don't feel we're ganging up on them, because this is not a traditional administration. This is not one that welcomes those diplomatic conversations. So we're going to have to continue to be very careful. And, we've had all these conversations with Sweden and Finland. Like, maybe it's time to actually float the idea of some type of national service, right? You look at a country like Finland that understands very clearly the threat that they face. We also have a challenge with youth unemployment in Canada. Like, maybe now's the time to be like, everybody, after you graduate, you spend a year or two in some volunteer capacity.
You just opened
whatever,
up a
right?
topic
That's a
for
whole other
like
show.
a whole other pod. But it's something worth pursuing. But I want to get back to what you said earlier, because it sounds to me, and I'm interested to hear from the two of you, that what you're saying is the likelihood of a private proponent or proponents to build this pipeline is diminishing, and that the urgency of the situation perhaps requires government or governments to step in.
I would say it's not just diminishing. The likelihood of a private sector proponent is diminishing. I would say it's almost zero. At this point, and this isn't anything new for Canada to have government.
What was it 6 months ago or 4 months ago?
It was
or 3
probably
months ago?
unlikely.
It was still unlikely
but
then.
none of this is new to Canada for national infrastructure projects that are in the national interest. In the 1950s, the Trans-Canada Mainline gas line in the 1950s would not have been built without federal government intervention. They set up a Crown corporation. They backstopped it. Line 9, Enbridge's Line 9, in the 1970s would not have been built without a federal government backstop. That was Pierre Elliott Trudeau who backstopped Line 9. KXL, our government, the government I was in, took an equity position in it. We've seen multiple occasions where the Alberta government has de-risked pipeline projects through APMC, Alberta Petroleum Marketing Commission, that was taking a shipping commitment to reduce the risk in the pipeline. So this is nothing new, and I think it's going to be the way forward.
It's nothing new, but politically it is, because as you know, the Premier has made it very clear we will get a private proponent. We won't be putting government money into it. But and Carney has said the same thing. The conversation is now changing. The argument being that this is national infrastructure. It is essential for the security of the country and the country's economy. Ergo, you put public money into it.
Well, and we'll see what comes out of Florida, or I think it's Florida, where Trump is meeting with the oil industry executives. I can't imagine that coming out of that meeting, there isn't some sort of government guarantee out of the United States to go into.
For sure.
So that sets a precedent. If he's giving government guarantees
that we have to do the same.
That we have to do the same.
But this Canada exists because of that kind of involvement, right? The railways, the St. Lawrence Seaway, all of these big nation-building projects that we often refer to as being so critical to the development of this country, none of that would have happened if you were only relying on private.
Not everyone sees it the same way, though. People don't necessarily see pipelines like they see railways connecting the country.
I would argue you should. Because it's just like government shouldn't be involved in things that private sector will do anyway. But if the private sector is not going to do them, a private sector is not going to build a highway across the country. So you think
it's zero too? You agree with Sonia? It's zero?
No, I actually think it's more likely than zero. There's still a lot of questions.
How much more likely than zero?
But zero if there is no support from the government.
Right. There's got to be a backstop.
And a backstop isn't necessarily partnership. It isn't necessarily equity. Look, we build dams in this country. We build all sorts of other infrastructure that requires either guarantees from governments so I think we need to get our heads around this. I would also venture we are in a very different world. And one, I completely agree with Gitane's earlier comments. We can't change geography. We're not going to move away from the United States. We can't, right, physically. So if you're going to pick China or the United States, and you've got to balance the massive geographical presence right to our south has to be a major factor in terms of let's be realistic. You can do elbows up all you want, but they are way bigger than we are. They are way more economically powerful, and we are way more dependent on them than we are in that. The other piece I would say, though, is if we have way more important discussions to have about national security. Energy East is not economically viable either, right? But we do have refineries in the east of this country that depend in some cases on Canadian oil, but it only gets there through the United States. If we have a problem with the United States and the Americans say, or maybe even just because they want leverage on our USMCA discussions that are coming up, they can go back to the folks in Michigan and say, yeah, we're going to cut that off. Government should not be involved if the private sector is going to do it on their own. But absolutely government involvement is needed if we have national security questions to deal with, if we have economic opportunities that simply require that kind of guarantee or backstopping. So my view is I think there are some folks in the private sector that would be very interested in increasing our export capability to Asia, in particular, given what's happened to Venezuela.
But the government has to be a part
involved.
of it, right?
100%.
Because that's what's happening in the U.S. I think we know that's what's happening in this conversation with these oil execs,
that's
right?
a bit the Boy Scout thing that I referred to earlier. It's not just, we're nice to everybody. It's also it's a question of being realistic. And we have to move beyond, we don't want the government to be involved. We're Canada. Look at our history. We would not be the country we are if we didn't actually have some of these serious engagements. So yes,
with all this, is the MOU still sufficient?
It needs deeper support, I would argue.
And I think you have to consider, government support can be financial, or it can be the government equivalent of exercising eminent domain. Like, we are going to see that this is built. We are going to remove the regulatory barriers. We are going to, provide the necessary accommodations with Indigenous peoples. And could a private proponent be an Indigenous consortium? Like, I think what you need to see is more political support from the federal government for that MOU to say that they too really want to see this pipeline built. Keeping in mind, we need to be careful about the CUSMA review coming up this year as well, and what that leverage would look like. Yeah,
and talk to me a bit more about that too, and then I'll come to you, Sonia, about CUSMA, because again, we need to do a separate pod just, I think, on that.
And when we say CUSMA for your listeners,
USMCA.
Sometimes we call it USMCA, sometimes we call it CUSMA,
NAFTA
but it's
2.0,
NAFTA 2.0,
Yeah.
Well, the review takes place this year.
Yeah.
This is the opportunity to say either, yes, this is an outstanding agreement, we'd like to renew it. There's also the opportunity to withdraw on 6 months' notice. I think that politically, President Trump, given that so much of U.S. industry supports the agreement and said they like the stability that it provides and they'd like to see it continue, in a rational world, I would not see him pull out of this agreement this year, certainly not before the U.S. midterm elections, because I think the Republicans know they're in trouble. But I don't think it's their advantage either to conclude some sort of review. I think he feels deeply that the level of uncertainty he has created is good for him, good for the United States. And so, but the situation with Venezuela does change the dynamic a bit, and that we previously had this, we know we have things that you need. Now we continue to, we can't discount the amount of our oil that goes to PADD 2 to the U.S. Midwest, and that is by pipeline. So that's not something that could easily be displaced by Venezuelan oil. That infrastructure flows in one direction.
Certainly in the short or medium term.
Right. In the short and medium term, the Gulf Coast is the most exposed. We continue to have critical minerals and potash and uranium and all kinds of other things that they need. But I think that that they will definitely try to use the situation in Venezuela to their advantage. And where we will see impacts is on the investment side. Like right now, he's meeting with oil executives. And we know we need U.S. investment to continue to grow our resource sector. And so if that money is not coming, where is it coming
I'm
from?
glad you raised that. I was wondering about that too.
And then we go back to the conversation of China. So who is investing in our industry, and are they countries that we're prepared to do business with or not?
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to add another comment on the MOU, whether it's sufficient. And I think the MOU goes a pretty substantial way for addressing some of the regulatory and policy uncertainty, but it doesn't address the commercial uncertainty, the things that industry needs to have to increase production and to buy onto a pipeline. You're not going to build a pipeline without firm shipping commitments, without the industry signing long-term contracts. The first question industry is going to ask if they're going to sign a long-term contract to ship on a pipeline is, how much is it going to cost? What's the toll going to be? And to be able to make a new West Coast pipeline work, the toll, the cost of moving the oil is going to have to be on par with what it costs the industry to move it south. That's why you're seeing a huge, that's why you're seeing some of the pipeline companies getting entrenched into their existing infrastructure systems and expanding it. Enbridge wants to expand their main line down to the U.S. to move more oil down there. Shippers know what the tolls are going to be on that. They know what the price. TMX wants to expand their existing system to the West Coast. Shippers are going to know the tolls and the price. A brand new pipeline, we're not going to know how much it's going to cost. So I think there's going to have to be some government involvement to give some guarantees to shippers, to the producers, on what it's going to cost. Because you can have all the regulatory certainty in the world to build a pipeline, but if you don't have the commercial aspects, it's not going to happen.
Okay, so with all that cost, the MOU also includes a commitment to pathways, and you want to talk about cost, and you have particular expertise in this area, Martha. Is that a priority?
Well, listen, having been involved in the creation of pathways, I'm still a huge fan. I do think climate change is a global challenge, and reducing emissions is important. Also, from a Canadian perspective, we want to be doing things well. We want our production to be clean and to be responsible.
Right.
So that's a good thing. I do caution, and I listened to the Prime Minister say this a couple of days ago, holding it out that, well, ours will be lower emissions and we'll using,
low risk, low cost, low carbon.
But also low carbon because, and I think he actually mentioned because of the pathways piece. Yep. The rest of the world, I think we have to be a little bit careful about how the rest of the world values that these days. This is not what did you say, Sonia?
The low carbon part.
This is not the China we had in 2010. This is also not even the Europeans are recognizing. The climate is really important, but the sacrifices that are being made in terms of security, in terms of economics, are coming home to roost a little bit.
That's why I'm asking, because I'm wondering
so
if
I think we have to be careful about thinking I think we in Canada have to stop thinking that is somehow the be-all and the end-all for our economic and security activities. The rest of the world is moving to a place where, most pundits are saying there's no way the world is going to get to net zero by 2050. Nobody takes pleasure in that. But if we acknowledge the rest of the world is saying that's simply not going to happen,
even in the shorter
Canada can't sacrifice its own economic and security interests with a view of net zero by 2050
Understood.
if the rest of the world
But this is about a
isn't gonna do it.
commitment of many billions of dollars at a time when there's a lot of costs.
Yeah, and this also, there becomes a political disconnect when people are worried about affordability, which Canadians deeply are. If you're worried about your survival, that's when it's that Maslow hierarchy of needs flips, right? You're worried about security, shelter, food, and fuel. Worrying about the future becomes a privilege. Worrying about the environment, unfortunately, also becomes more of a privilege because you're focused on your immediate needs. And so if we are in a situation where it is a real existential crisis, right, then to Martha's point, I believe climate change is real, caused by human activity. I want my children to inherit an inhabitable world, and I also want them to live long enough to see it, right? So we're going to need to make some hard decisions where maybe we're pushing things out or we're shifting around our priorities.
Yeah, you know what? I'm a huge fan of Pathways Initiative, and to lower emissions in our oil sands. And I was actually pleased to hear Mark Carney refer to our production as low cost, low risk, low carbon. The first time I heard that expression was in 2020, and that was from the CEO of Saudi Aramco. He was referring to Saudi Arabian oil, and it was at a different time. It was during just coming out of the first wave of the COVID pandemic, when we were looking at a world, we didn't know what was going to be left standing in the oil industry. We were looking at a world that was looking like it was going to do an accelerated transition off of fossil fuels, and only the best production would survive. So he was talking about Saudi Arabia's production in that terms. And I was energy minister at the time, and I thought, how clever that. Why can't we apply that to Alberta's oil? Because we're low risk, low cost. Most of our production's in the oil sands, which is long-term plays. The facilities are already built. We know the resources there. We don't have to continuously drill for it. It's low risk, low cost. And the low carbon piece was the piece on the icing on the cake, if you can bring in CCUS. So it's I think that's still a relevant conversation, low risk, low cost, and low carbon too. I mean, we're in an area right now where it doesn't look like climate change is being prioritized, but it's still a problem.
Right.
It's still going to have to be addressed. It's not going to go
And
away.
this technology can be deployed and sold.
It's just that Canada has to stop thinking that Canada alone is going to solve global climate change. We're just not that big. We just don't produce nearly the amount of emissions that will make
in total. Environmentalists always point to per capita.
We
but
just
yes.
won't make a difference, and we won't make a difference. And again, take no pleasure in this, right? Because we do recognize it's a problem, or at least most of us do. But this is the Boy Scout thing again. Canada has to realize we're not going to solve global climate change. And if the Americans and the Chinese and the Indians and the Venezuelans and everyone else producing really doesn't care anymore, we have to be realistic.
Okay. Final.
But there is an opportunity. Sorry to interrupt. There is an opportunity there, right? If you can somehow afford to develop that technology, there is a tremendous opportunity for Canada there
100%.
Because the world does need it.
Because you can sell it, right? I mean, you can commercialize it, and it can. It's initially very expensive, but it's longer term it can be quite profitable.
But we're
It's just a
also
question
not
of
the
how you
only
pay for it
ones
now.
doing it. I mean, there are CCUS projects, quite a lot of them all around the world. Do we stand to gain from that expertise? 100%.
Right.
In terms of our ability to export our capabilities.
Okay, I'm going to end on politics. I mean, it's a political podcast, even though we haven't really talked a lot about politics, but some. It obviously permeates through everything that we're discussing. And before we were recording, we had talked about the Politico newsletter that came out Friday morning, which I thought was worth just exploring as a final area. So they reported, according to a Liberal MP that they spoke to, obviously not on the record, that Mark Carney had warned his caucus last month that the pipeline deal is not just an economic win, but a strategic necessity to keep the country together. Is that the right message, and is he correct?
I would say he's correct. He was correct, and it's probably following long discussions he had with Premier Smith on what she's facing in the province with the growing separatist movement and the growing sense of alienation in the province. That's, it is a significant amount of the population who expresses sentiment for separation, and I think if it's very volatile. It's very volatile, and I actually think there'd be a larger percentage of the population would vote in support of separation than the percentage of people who actually want to separate, to make a point.
And rather than what the polling shows.
Yeah, I think so.
So we shouldn't sort of believe the polling necessarily, because it's pretty generally anemic.
I know lots of people who would say, I would never support separation, but on a referendum, I might actually vote for it just because we need to send a message.
Yeah, 100%. I don't think we'll never get over 50% that support separation, but even getting 30%, that sends a pretty shaky signal to to the country and to the economy and to the global. It just sends a very bad message.
Well, and it's in the context of Plamondon is likely to become the next premier in
Right.
Quebec in less than a year, and he is a separatist. I mean, he is vowed to do a referendum. Now, who knows how many people would vote in favor?
But in a
at this
province
time?
like this, and given everything that we've just discussed, even the idea of having a campaign, never mind a vote, and who knows what that might be. But as you say, some people, it may be more people voting yes just to protest, not because they necessarily want to separate. That obviously has a big impact on, we talked about where will the investment dollars come from? And that's already kind of a treacherous area to explore the more you think about it, given the current context. This just adds to it.
Yeah, it's terrible for investment, and it's terrible when you are renegotiating a trade agreement with a partner who likes to make jokes about Canada becoming the 51st state. So any point of perceived weakness will be exploited. So I think that the Prime Minister is, one, speaking from the heart. He grew up here, so I think he actually maybe understands Alberta. So many of my colleagues in Ottawa sort of poo-poo the sentiment, saying, oh, you guys complain all the time. We bought you a pipeline. Like, they don't actually understand the sentiment here. So I think he gets that, and I think he also understands it strategically. Like, now is not a good time to be having conversations around separation.
Well, I think he's managing his caucus too, because there's a large element in that caucus who spent the last 10 years fighting against pipelines, focusing on climate policy rather than energy policy.
A lot
and
of them would be
there.
unemployed right now if he wasn't leading the
Yeah,
Well,
party,
this
too.
is exactly right. Who do you owe your job to right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a growing environment caucus in the Liberal Party. So I think he's got to do caucus management, and I think putting it out there what's at stakes at a very high level is probably good caucus management.
I think I can safely say this has been the most interesting, productive, informative conversation on the situation that has unfolded this week that I've heard, and I've listened to a lot of them. So thank you all, Martha, Sonia, Gitane. Just awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.